Great, thank you, Angie. He was, yeah, but what he did was he did like just a lot of tricks. You know, it was like, if you do this, you'll get that. It was like, but you know, you can still learn a lot from his brush, from how he works his brush, whether you want to take it as, you know, high art or not. He had skills, and you can learn how the paint works, how to work with brushes.
And his presentation was went along with it.
Right, he was just, they were interesting.
He personified stuff. He put a little, he named this little tree that he put here in this little spot, you know, this little rock, and that's, you know.
I think he brought a lot of joy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, my father just adored him. I remember making, like, taping his shows because my father didn't know where to find him or whatever. And he was just starting to paint like in his 80s. And he was fascinated. So I made all these tapes of Bob Ross. He just loved him. And that's how he painted, was just sort of in that. Yeah. He's interesting.
Is that where you got your interest in art?
I think it is, actually, because even when I was little, my father would draw. I'm going to be perfectly honest and tell you he wasn't really any good at all, but he just loved it. And he just drew the same thing over and over again. He would draw horses, and they didn't look much like horses, but, you know, I really loved my father. And all I can think, I've thought about that later, is that where I got it? Because there was nowhere else in my life was I ever exposed to art in my entire life. So how on earth did I end up on this path?
And I asked myself, why didn't I?
Yeah.
Because I had no exposure.
You have to have
And
some.
so, yeah, you have to have something, because this fascinates me. I love this.
Good.
And I feel like,
Well, it fascinates a lot of people once they begin to learn about it.
yeah.
But it's not the sort of thing, like, you're not going to just ordinarily learn about art history like in high school. It's not a subject you're going to find before college. And even then, you're going to have to seek it out,
Right.
unless you accidentally take a class as part of some, you know, gen ed requirement or something.
My daughter has a master's in art history.
Yeah,
And
you've
she
mentioned that.
has been involved since she was little, and I still remember some of the stuff. This kid had we had a coffee table, you know, round little coffee table that was her thing, and she had the crayons and the paints and all this stuff from the time she could walk to
Yeah.
that table. And I remember getting in trouble I think she was in first grade. So anyway, she came home with the teacher had criticized whatever she was doing, and she was all upset. And what it came to, they were all coloring something, and she decided to color her tree a different purple or whatever it was. And because she had been taught that it's your elephant and you make it any color you want. You know?
Right.
So she carried it on to art class or school, and the teacher said, no, the tree is green. And so I had to go explain to the teacher where her concept was, that it was her tree and she could make it purple if she wanted.
Sure, I can't imagine a teacher doing that. Certainly not today. Yeah.
And what that reminds me of is what you asked us to read. I mean, David
David.
had a very narrow picture of what art should be.
Yeah, that's the irony of what he wrote, because that's what he's accusing the others of doing, which is exactly what he did. Yeah, it's real irony. And we will be looking at a lot of sort of artist writings, you know, at this depth. I like to look at what did they actually have to say? So I have excerpts from things that artists said. Yeah, this is a slightly updated version of the one that I sent you in an email. So if you'd like a slightly updated version, I added a couple of things to it.
In that folder and everything, and I left it at home.
Yeah,
Oh.
no, I couldn't find one.
Yeah.
But I had read it.
No, I
Hey, Jan,
Hello, hello.
got some more people from home.
Well, you know,
We've got quite a few people from home.
my uncle in Chicago studied Albert, and he talked about color.
Oh, he studied with Joseph Albers? Oh, wow. Back when he taught it, because he taught at Harvard, I think.
Who did?
No, Albers taught at Black Mountain College.
My uncle taught at Northwestern. He was head of the art department.
But he knew Joseph Albers.
Same recipe.
I wonder where he knew him.
Huh?
He must, wow. Because Albers, I'm trying to remember, keep him straight.
My
Joseph
uncle
Albers
was
taught at Black Mountain College in North Carolina after he left the Bauhaus and
And
came to this
he
country.
may have been on a sabbatical.
But all of those people that studied at the Bauhaus or with Bauhaus, former Bauhaus teachers, they are so like connected to that system. Like they just maintain that system forever. Like I studied design with someone who studied design with someone who taught at the Bauhaus, and he still generations later like, swore by that program and taught exactly what the Bauhaus taught.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's, if you put one color next to a different color,
Yeah.
it changes both.
Yeah, that's
And it's
pure, it's
true,
pure Albers.
yeah.
Yep.
That would be an interesting subject in itself for another little time.
Yeah.
That Bauhaus movement and
Well, yeah, we will get to the Bauhaus movement in the
oh,
spring.
great,
When we get into the 20th century, we'll definitely look at the Bauhaus.
great.
Talk about that in some detail. I added a couple of things, mostly the same. Yeah, but there are a couple of things I added to it, though. There are a couple of artists I added to it. I'm gonna get some more water and wait a few more minutes to see if he shows up.
We're gonna wait to be surprised.
Oh, it's not that big a deal.
There has been some.
So we're part live and
Not
part
what I
Zoom.
expected.
Yeah, we've got the printer and Sherry realized that we
Yeah,
have
it's
a
gonna be
page
more.
on my sample of printing. So that we have one down printer that worked for a long time. We had one that wanted, you know, we had the cartridge job.
Oh,
yeah.
And
It was,
I
and
guess
so she got one that was black and
there
white.
too. Really good
Well,
one.
it depends on what you print. If you look at the colors, that's what it just do. I said, well, if you don't print, they'll dry out. Well, I'm sure our state. Really expensive.
Well, I would never have guessed.
Well, anyhow, we have a real good printer. Well, that's the deal. And we didn't know how to work it right. Printing companies could give you printers free because they make it on the cartridge. They should give you the printer. Ours was one of those.
That's why I like Shaquille O'Neal and his ad looking for magenta. The Epson or somebody's got kind with the really big cartridges.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can do this. Oh, oops, that's not what I want to see on the screen. That's what I want to see on the screen. And the other thing I want to do, I love all you people on Zoom, welcome. But
Welcome to you. We're glad to be
But I'm
here.
gonna hide your faces here on the screen so that I'm gonna slide that down there. So hopefully I don't block anything. Okay, can everybody see the full screen now?
Yes.
Everybody on Zoom, are you seeing the full screen?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, so let's go. If anybody else comes, then they come. But in the meantime, we'll go with what we've got. So today we're going to actually start talking about modernism and begin to look at how we reach that point. And one of the things we'll be looking at as we're still in the 19th century is the various ways that people at the time thought of modernism. What did it mean to them? What did being modern mean in 1785? I mean, how the heck are we supposed to know what that means? It didn't even mean the same to us like 50 years ago. So I guarantee a couple hundred years ago, it meant something entirely differently. So the birth of modernity, as we call it, or modernism, isn't something that happens overnight. It is literally a process. It's a series of stages that we go through, and each of those is relevant to what is happening at the time, or what is defined as the what art should be at any given moment. What we're starting with today is this idea of being modern means being moral, being morally superior to the previous generation. And we'll see in a minute why they thought that. So that's where it begins. So today I'm going to talk about classicism and the academy. Then later, we'll begin to look at romanticism next week, in fact, and that's when values begin to change. And we'll talk about the idea of the middle class, the rising middle class, what that has to do with industrialism, and how that changed art very dramatically. And we're going to focus particularly on landscape when we get to romanticism next week. By the mid-19th century, there are going to be more shifts, and focus will be on very different from either classicism or romanticism. And it's going to be a shift on what's happening right now and how that actually looks. And art's going to become much more socio-political commentary. And this is going to come about for a number of reasons. One important one is the rise of socialism, and we'll talk about the role socialism plays in Europe during this period. Later, by the 70s and 80s, there's going to be much more attention on thinking of the modern world as a place that changes constantly. They're going to see that as the driving force of how modern is defined. We'll see that in the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. And then at the end of the century, by the 90s, there's going to be a backlash against realism, a very strong anti-realist movement that favors the imagination. In fact, they're gonna look at artists who merely depict the world around them and see that as very common and very low. And art should be about imagination and invention, and that's going to be a backlash against all of this realism that's going to dominate a good part of the century. So let's talk about classicism and the academy and what that actually means. I can figure out how to move this. Okay. Why the fascination with classicism? First of all, classicism is a reference to anything that revives the style of the ancient Greco-Roman world. That's what they mean by classicism, classical. And we'll see that as we look at specific works of art and talk about that more. That revival of interest in the ancient world, particularly Rome, even though they're primarily looking at Greek art, but they're thinking of Rome. That is inspired by the excavations, the discovery and excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum. This begins in the 18th century, as you can see, Herculaneum first in 1738 and then Pompeii. And there was a kind of international fascination with this when archaeologists started pulling out all these things from the ancient world. It was just a cultural phenomenon. Not unlike when Tut's tomb was discovered in the early 20th century, it became a cultural phenomenon, and furniture styles reflected it and clothing styles reflected it. The same thing happened here, and we'll see this in a number of contexts. It also inspired a German historian named Winkelmann to write really the first book that was supposedly the history of ancient art. In many ways, we consider it the first art history book, the first book that really looks at history.
What is Herculaneum?
Herculaneum is a city near Pompeii. The two cities were destroyed at the same time. Herculaneum and Pompeii were destroyed.
Okay.
And
Industrialism doesn't get no
it
respect.
does not get the respect. It absolutely does not get any respect at all. But it was the first one discovered. It was just as important at the time as Pompeii. But you're right, most people don't hear about it because everybody talks about Pompeii.
So it was discovered 10 years.
It was
before.
earlier. Yeah, it was discovered first. Both of them were sort of resort towns where the very rich Romans went, and there were a lot of expensive villas, and they were very interesting cities. So Winkelmann writes the first art history. In many ways, history itself is a modern concept, and we'll talk about that also coming up. Why? Well, not today, but we will come back to that idea of what is history and when did it begin, and when did real history begin. And this isn't sort of the history that we're really thinking about today. Now, the problem with Winkelmann was that he just made all this up. The problem is he looked at all this art, this Greco-Roman art. He's primarily looking at Greek sculpture and Roman copies of Greek sculpture, and he's interpreting it through his moment in time, as opposed to truly understanding the past. If you remember from Greek art, which we did last year, Greek art is primarily, it's all idealized, right? It's not realistic. You don't see old people or ugly people or fat people. You see perfect human forms. And so Winkelmann is interpreting that as the ancient world having been a lost golden age. Like, he really believed people were like that. That's how he talks, as if the world really was like that. And he's juxtaposing that in some ways to his own world. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment is happening. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the monarchy in France. They're increasingly seeing their own world as corrupt. And so they wanted to find this perfect past. The Enlightenment is about becoming your better self through rationalism. And so here he discovers what he thinks is this ancient world rooted in rational thought, in which everyone lived in a kind of perfect, idyllic utopia. That's what he wanted to find, so that's what he found. He wanted to believe it was possible. They all wanted to believe it. So that's what he wrote about. When you read Winkelmann today, it just sounds incredibly naive. You read it and you think, he can't really believe this, can he? It really does read that way. And I think we have to read it in context that, they wanted to believe this was true. Yeah.
You're showing the picture of his book there.
Yep.
How did technology get to the point where they could reprint it? How many illustrations did he have?
Well, there weren't as many as there would be in the 19th century, because they didn't have lithography yet. So there are I haven't seen the original. I've just seen, translations of it. But, since the printing press, you could print books, even with illustrations, but they become more common in the 19th century, not in the 18th. So not as many illustrations. It's mostly like a lot of descriptions with a few illustrations. But this was mass produced. The history of ancient art, a history of antique art. That's Winkelmann. Very important to art historians. When we study our own history, we always start with Winkelmann. He's a sort of a god to the art historians, even though a bizarre sort of god. It reflects their search for perfection. And it really shows how classicism is being linked to moral superiority. And that's another problem in its own right, because the first classicism comes out of the Greek world, really, or Greco-Roman in their minds. The second classical period is the Renaissance. So they're going to also elevate the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was a revival of the ancient world. And then thirdly, they're going to look to the great 17th century French painter, Nicolas Poussin, who's connected to the Academy, which we'll talk about in just a moment, who really brought classicism to France and made it the national style. So let's talk about the French Academy for a while, because this is the foundation of everything. And understanding the Academy, you will understand the art of the early 19th century. If you remember, if those of you that were with us when we did Western art, the French Academy was founded in 1648. There were a number of academies. This particular academy is the one dedicated to painters and sculptors. It changes names a couple times. In the 19th century, it becomes known as the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which just means fine art, Academy of Fine Art. We usually refer to it as Beaux-Arts, even though it didn't get that name, but it's really the same sort of structure. It was created in the 17th century under the sponsorship of Louis XIV, primarily as a way of creating a true French tradition in art. In the 17th century, France was becoming an important power. It was gradually becoming the center of the Western art world. Before that, Italy was, right? The Renaissance, 15th, 16th century, and even the early 17th, Italy was the center of the art world in the West. But that changes in the 17th century, and it's largely because of Louis XIV, his power. When he began rebuilding the palace at Versailles, he brought in Italian artists. He kind of had to. France didn't have a huge artistic tradition at that time, and he wanted to change that. So he wanted to create this institution called the Academy to both train artists, because it has a school, the école, which just means school, associated with it. And also they held the salon, the biennial salon. Salon is the exhibition that was at this time, at first, every 2 years. And then in, I think, 1833, it becomes annual and it gets even bigger. And the salon was held in the Louvre Palace, and it became important. So this institution was responsible for training artists and then giving them an opportunity to show their work. There were different levels of participation. The school, or the école, anyone, well, not anyone, any French, at first you had to be French, you had to be male, you had to be single, and you had to pass a very rigorous exam, and then you could attend the school. It was primarily for people in their 20s. Usually you entered the école in your late teens, 18, 17, 18. Earlier than that, you were very precocious if you got in earlier than that, and we'll see some artists who did. And then through your 20s, you were still a student, and you were working in someone's studio and learning. Then the other level is actual, what we call academicians. And these are people who joined the Academy as academicians. There were 40 members. There were always 40 members of the Academy from the day it was founded. The only way for a new member to enter is for an old member to die. So they kept it at 40. That kept it very sort of elite.
Does that mean as a member, your art was presented? Or?
Well, as a member, you controlled the education system, you controlled the school, and you controlled who got to show in the salon. It was a real, you were in power, man. If you were an academician, you were the cream of the crop. And you got the best commissions, you ran the best studios, everybody wanted to be your student. Yeah.
So those people were like the board of directors, and then
Yes.
they had instructors under them?
Yes, yes. They weren't the only ones that taught at the école. There were other artists who could teach who were not yet academicians. You know, there might not be an opening for an academician till you're like 60 years old, until somebody dies. So not all great artists were academicians or members of the Academy, but if you were in power. You were very much in power, and they controlled the arts, and they kept a tight fist on the arts. You really had to work in a certain way. At the school, you were taught to work in a classical way. You were taught only one way to make art. Anyone could theoretically submit to the salon exhibition. Didn't mean you were going to get in. obviously there was favoritism. The academicians, a jury was formed, not all 40 of them decided, but they created a jury to make the decision. But, you know, their students would be favored. You were favored if you worked in the approved style. So it was very, very controlled and very important. They began giving awards. The whole school system was centered around competitions. It was extremely competitive. First of all, you had to compete just to get into the Cole, which wasn't easy, which is why a lot of other private schools developed to train you for the examination to get into the formal school. After all, you were fairly old. I mean, these were for younger people. So most people went to like a prep school first to prepare for the exam to get into the formal school at the academy. And so once you got into the school, you competed for everything. There were competitions held for every class. You want this class? Okay, we're going to compete for it. Let's have a competition. Once you got into the class, there were competitions for where you could sit in the room, because there are better seats, you know, that are closer to the model or whatever. So they competed for that. And then there would be competitions throughout the year, competitions in who does the best hand gestures, who does the best perspective, who does the best, you know, composition. Yeah.
Yeah, you just answered. I was wondering what the competition was.
Competitions, you make art and they decide who does it better. Whatever they assign you to do, the best person gets the best. But it really, what it does is, on the one hand, you think, well, that's really good because it pushes people to do their best. On the other hand, it pushes you toward a specific style more. You know, you better do this thing better than someone else does that thing. Don't try and put your own variation in or go off in a new direction. That's not going to get you. So it fostered conformity to a very specific level of work. When you were admitted to the school, you were admitted in one of, at least most of the period, in one of 4 categories. You were admitted as a history painter. I'll explain that in a minute. A portrait painter, a landscape painter, or a still life painter. And that's a hierarchy, a clear hierarchy. Number 1 at the top, history painting. That's what everybody wanted to do. It's what everybody wanted to be admitted as. History painting was more than just historical scenes. It included religious scenes, mythology. What it really means is a narrative, a storytelling. Because histoire in French doesn't mean history, it means story. So history painting means narrative art or storytelling. And because it's classical, it needs to be a grand story, a really important story. Classical art purports to be extremely important in everything it does. So that's what you wanted to do. And as we'll see, artists that do that, you know, you're lower status if you're a landscape painter. There were still plenty of them, but it wasn't regarded as important as history painting. Below that is portrait, below that, you know, so there's a hierarchy and everyone wants to do the same thing, but there's not enough commissions.
Did people wash out of this school frequently then? That's probably the wrong term.
It's not really, because it's so stiff to get in that if you get in, you're at a certain level.
Even though you were a history group,
Right.
And you painted the lousiest histories.
No, you didn't paint histories if you were a landscape. You did what you did. That's it. You didn't cross boundaries. Landscape painters competed against landscape painters, and you didn't paint anything but landscapes. So you were in your own little category, and many of the prizes were specific. I mean, even in these competitions, you were only competing against people who did what, you know, the same sort of thing. Yeah.
Did they have something for the sculptures?
Yes, there's a sculpture section. There's a printmaking section. Much later, they will actually join with the architecture school, music. The literary academies always stay separate, but there are all sorts of academies for different things. And then they will later split off from architecture again, but there is something very similar for all the different art forms and media. It has its own version of something like this.
A strict way of teaching.
teaching it. And
Yeah, I don't know a lot of the details about like music and sculpt and architecture. Well, music, I don't.
so-
Architecture is pretty specific in terms of what you were supposed to do at that time. It's why you can see architectural styles changing as well. Yeah.
So if you were in the academy, you ate on a regular basis and had a roof over your head, and the rest of the artist population were out there trying to
Well,
get commissions
if you were in the
and sell
school,
art.
if you were a member of the school, if you were an academician, you had it made. If you were an academician, you had your own private studio rooms in the Louvre Palace. I mean, you had everything you needed. But if you were it depends. I mean, some were better than others. But if you were a student studying with an important painter, yeah, you did just fine. Especially if you won important prizes, which is why these prizes become so very important. And I'll come to that important prizes in just a minute. What they studied at the École actually was drawing. Drawing was number one. Everyone studied drawing. Drawing was what the classes at the École were about. They also had lectures in theory and the like, but they didn't have painting classes at the school. That you got by being in someone's studio, atelier. Atelier is French for studio, but it actually means more than just a studio. An atelier is like a teaching studio. An important artist who has formed his own studio will take on maybe 15, 20 younger artists, and that's where they'll learn to paint directly with their teacher. But they're also his assistants. So it's mutually beneficial. It's kind of like having an internship. That's what it reminds me of, where an internship, somebody's going to get free labor from someone who's learning to do what you do. And that's where you learn painting. So getting into the studio of an important painter was just as important as being a member at the school itself. So you learn drawing in one place, and you learn drawing first by copying. Number one, you start learning drawing by copying drawings. Then you learn to copy prints. Then you learn to draw from sculpture, like casts of Greek sculptures, for example. And then last, after you've mastered all that, then you move on to the figure. And then you get the live male model, mostly male models. And that's sort of a sequence. It's really deeply rooted in technical skill, and you slowly develop these techniques and technical skill. While on the other hand, maybe the afternoon, now you go and you do painting, working on your teacher's works and the like, and we'll see more examples of that. They opened a sort of annex division of the French Academy in Rome. It's known as the French Academy in Rome. And the most important prize, the Prix de Rome, or the Grand Prix de Rome, would win you it varied 3 to 6 years in Rome at the Academy in Rome, free, room, board, everything. This is the number one prize, was the Prix de Rome. Everyone wanted to win. And there was a separate category. There was a history painting category. There was a landscape painting category. So again, you're just competing. So multiple awards, but the grandest was history painting, Prix de Rome. You win that, you are number one. You are guaranteed great success. You probably go right into doing royal commissions, etc. And I want to talk about, well, first of all, I just want to say, I keep saying male because women were first admitted to the school or the academy, the school itself, in 1897. That's the first time women were admitted. And I seem to have read not that long ago, somewhere in the last 10 years, I think, was the first woman president of the academy, finally. But all of this is taking place at this time. I want to talk about the Prix de Rome, because the Prix de Rome is like number one prize. This is the one you wanted, the most prestigious. And it lasted 106 days. The competition took 1/3 of the year, and they went through stages of development, narrowing it down from 100. He started with 100 applicants. It was hard to even get into the 100. And then those 100 had to do a compositional painting. And then from that, they picked 20 to move on. And then from those 20, they picked 10 to go into the final round. And David, the artist we're going to talk about in a minute, he won on his 4th attempt. And after one of his earlier attempts, he actually attempted suicide because he failed. That's how important this is to your career, or was to his career. The second phase was the human figure. You had to do a painting from a live model. And that's where a lot of them failed. I mean, they were so picky. But David did finally win. Oh, I forgot I had this here. This just says what I just said. 100 entrants, oil sketch, nude figure, and then the 10 finalists. And for each of these, they're literally locked away into a room alone in the Louvre for like 17 hours or 24 hours, or the whole thing lasting 106 days. When it ended, it was a big to-do. It was like in Paris at the end, every year at the end of the Prix de Rome, was like going to the Academy Awards. Everyone came out. It was the news of the city. It was a big formal thing. And they would announce the winner. You know, the thing is, it is possible that no one would win. If they didn't think anybody was good enough, they wouldn't award the prize. It would carry over to the next year. If they still didn't think anybody was good, it would carry over. That's the most ever awarded in one year were 3. So 2 previous years, nobody won. Yeah.
This is undisclosed subject.
Well, meaning they didn't know in advance.
Okay, so it's given to.
It was given to them at the last minute. Once they were all, they couldn't prepare, they couldn't think about it. They were just, okay, we're going to lock you in this room. Here's your subject, give me a drawing. And you had to think about how, you had to, number one, know if you know if it's a Greek myth or historical, you better know what that is, because you can't do any research.
They all had the same.
They all had the same subject. And it was,
Reality show.
That's what I was thinking. And there was one very similar because they had different artists.
I remember
But
that.
they
I
were some
remember that.
painters and some were photographers, but I think they used about the same subject.
It would make it,
Yeah.
you see how stressful this was when your whole life is centered, at least it probably felt like that. And then they decide, well, no, we're not going to award one this year. Yeah, that would have been incredibly,
People could have got murdered over that.
they could have.
They were nice. But they shame these people that work so hard, embarrass them.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's, you know, the French still do that. I mean, that's a very French thing to do, actually.
To compete like that.
No, to shame people. Seriously, it's actually very European in general compared to American. I know a lot of people educated in Europe, and their educational systems, you know, they'll just come down and they shame you a lot for failing and for not doing well. And we just don't do that. But it is very European, and it's very French on top of that. So let's talk about our friend David, who won the Rome Prize, as I said, eventually, and went to Rome. That's actually the painting that he won the Rome Prize with. It's, I can't even remember the name of the myth. I had to look it up. It's a totally obscure Greek myth that, and I've studied mythology in depth for years, and I'd never heard of this story, but he had to know it, and he won with that piece. It's very classic. I mean, the problem with these paintings from this period is they all look alike. And that's, you know, one of the big issues that is problematic with the piece. This is his reception piece when he became an academician. You know, after he won with this piece, he went to Rome for 3 years and then got an extension beyond that. And when he returned to Paris in 1780, he was 33 years old, which is a fairly typical age to be sort of moving into that next realm, opening your own studio. That's kind of what happens at this point in time. And then not long after that, 83, he was admitted as really an associate. Once you're an academician, it's kind of like academics today. You start as an assistant professor and you move up to associate and then full professor. They have those levels in the academy. So he entered the academy and then went back to Rome. And this was his reception piece. When you're applying for membership, there's somebody dies, right? So there's an opening for an academician. And then if you're applying, you submit a piece, an admissions piece. And this was his admissions piece. He was known for his ability to speak in a kind of heroic classical language. One of the things David was a master at is taking these subjects from ancient history or ancient mythology, and this is a subject from the Iliad of Andromache mourning Hector. He was a Trojan hero, and he was very good at speaking about contemporary issues in an ancient language. So like when he speaks about heroism and duty, he's really speaking about what's going on in France. And we need to be aware, we're in the 1780s and revolution is in the air. The French Revolution begins in 1789. We're not that far from it. And the criticism of the monarchy is very strong, really for the last 20 years or so before that happens. So this isn't like an open criticism, but he does begin to openly criticize a lot more. He'd won awards actually for dramatic gesture. You see that in a lot of his works. He has a style where he doesn't give you a lot of space. He usually puts things in the background that sort of stop your, I hope you're seeing that better. Does that look purple to you? Because it sure does where I'm from. It doesn't?
Yes.
It does. It is. That color is terrible. It's not what it looks like on my screen at all. I have to look at some color balancing on that television before we come back, because that's terrible. It really doesn't look purple at all. But anyway, this one got him some attention and got him into being an academician. This is one of his most famous works. You may remember this from last year. We talked about it. Does anybody remember what the story is here?
Is it brothers
They're brothers, 3 brothers on the left,
and their wives?
and well, one of them is a wife, one of them is her sister, and the woman in the black is a nurse who's sort of taking care of the children. It's called The Oath of the Horatii. He painted this in Rome because he went back to Rome, after he became an academician, he went back there again. The reason French artists went to Rome was to study classical sculpture and architecture. They want to be classical, you go to Rome. That's where you're going to find the Greek art. It's where you're going to find the Roman art. So you go there to study sculpture, Roman and Greek sculpture, and also architecture for details and the like. This,
It's a big painting.
it's 11 by 4. Yeah, actually, given the standards at this point in time, it's not that huge. We're going to see some much bigger ones. You remember that picture of the Salon exhibition, the larger the work, the higher it hung on the wall. So it's going to be high. So let me make it a little bit bigger. And then they put it higher and I said, well, I better make it a little bit bigger still. So the system of hanging art encouraged art to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it absolutely does. I think 30 foot is the largest one we're going to look at today. In fact, he actually enlarged it 50% higher than it was supposed to be when he got the commission. This is his first royal commission. He's an academician now. So the officials who handle art for the royal family commissioned him to do this subject. And this is a really interesting subject in terms of how it was being seen at the time by different people. Let me tell you the story. First of all, it's based on a play that was written by a French playwright named Pierre Corneille, called the Horace, and it was very well known in France. The French would have known this play in the same way the British would have recognized the scene from Hamlet. I mean, it was just that you didn't have to explain to a Frenchman what was going on in this painting. It was perfectly well known. In the story, it took place. It's a story that is associated with the founding of the Roman Republic, which is like the 8th century BCE, way back when the Latins all came together, the Latin tribes came together and formed the republic, a true republic. So it's, first of all, it's about the founding of a republic. That's very important at this moment in France, because that's what a lot of people want to do. They want to get rid of the monarchy and form a republic. So right away, there's a subtext here that is very contemporary. But the Horatii family supported the new republic, but their neighbors, family down the road, the Curatio family, they wanted to support the monarchy and keep Rome a monarchy. So rather than have a big war over it, the two families decided that 3 sons from one family and 3 sons from the other would come together in battle. Last man standing would decide whether Rome was going to stay a monarchy or whether it was going to become a republic. And of course, we know it became a republic. So one of these 3 triplets, by the way, in the story, they're triplets, one of them is going to be victorious. Their father in the middle is holding the swords, and they are taking an oath on their swords. They're swearing. And the oath they're taking is the one that Greeks took, even though this is Rome, to come home with your, basically come home with your shield or on it, is how it was worded. In other words, victorious or dead. Either you win or your body is brought back. That's it. This mixing of Greek and Roman is common through this period. Much of Winckelmann's book completely confused Greek and Roman ideas and history. They just got them all mixed up. So they didn't worry that much that it's sort of.
Weren't they confused in reality though? I mean, didn't the Romans take on a lot of the Greek stuff?
Some things, but not very many. Roman culture, they stole the art. And they took a lot of the mythology, but the society itself was very different. The culture was very different. That's another whole thing we can do later. They were very different. So what happens in the story? Okay, so on the right side, we have the women of the family. We have, see if I get my cursor in here. This is the wife of one of these 3 men, and she is actually the sister of the 3 men they're going to go fight. So the families are intermarried. She is the sister of these guys, but she is engaged to one of the 3 men that they're going to fight. So what these women know is that there's no way to win this, everybody loses. But the way David is presenting it, he wants them to look weak. This is about the strong, heroic left side of the painting versus the weak, immoral right side of the painting. And we know that because in the story, one of these brothers is the last man standing. He comes home and his sister curses him. She's really angry. He killed her fiance. He's really mad at her. He's so upset with her inability to understand this moral requirement that he had that he kills his sister. He's then put on trial, and the father makes this dramatic plea to the jury on behalf of his son that he only did what was right. You cannot blame him because she was acting totally improperly and immorally, and he's acquitted. What a wonderful story. It's a bizarre story, but it's perfectly appropriate for this moment in time. It's 1785, 4 years before the Bastille is stormed. David himself was very political. He was a member of the Jacobin Party, which was the political party responsible for the revolution and the Reign of Terror, which followed it. It seems to reflect pretty clearly a sort of absolute self-righteousness among those who think they can do no wrong. It's a moral justification of anything. It's naive. To our eye, it's bizarre. But at the time, it was the essence of the heroic. It was this is heroism, doing your duty no matter what. It doesn't matter that somebody else is going to die, that your family's going to. This is duty over family. The hell with the family, duty, and it's that kind of thinking that allowed the revolution to take place, and more importantly, the Reign of Terror that followed the revolution. This is a perfect matching of form and subject. Now, that's what makes good art. How he's painting it directly reflects the rigidity of the idea that he's communicating. That's perfectly symmetrical. You've got the three parts. He's divided it into sort of three segments, reflected by the arches in the background: the left, the middle, the right. Everything's painted very stiffly. It's like frozen sculpture. There's something so rigid about how it's presented and how that relates to what is presented. It's sort of a perfect structural moment. In terms of the composition, it's these vertical uprights that are alert, the sort of horizontality of the collapsing women, which is sort of passive, that we talked about last time. The stabilizing triangles. In fact, last week I looked at this and we had all the lines in it, how it was creating the pyramids and the angles that draw your eye. I decided not to bring that back because we just looked at it last week, but everything is very calculated. In fact, it's set up very much like a little theatrical stage set, right? Doesn't look like he's painted a picture of the play itself. I mean, it really does appear to be that way. Whether he actually was, we don't really know. Some people have suggested this was an actual scene in the play, but nobody really knows that that was true, that it would have been staged to look like this. But it's the essence of pride, inflexibility, rigidity, and arrogance. I mean, I can't think of anything more arrogant than thinking you have the right answer and everyone else be damned. I mean, that's about as arrogant as you can get, as many of us have witnessed in the last decade. What's interesting is 4 years before the revolution. I do want to show you this image I found online that shows an engraving of the salon of 87. This is the salon of 1787. And you can see the painting right here, how it hung. What's also interesting, when I saw this, whoever posted this clearly selected several paintings that they were going to talk about, but I did want to point this one out over here. This painting on the right is actually a self-portrait of a woman painter named Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was a favorite portraitist of Marie Antoinette. So it does tell us that even though women were not in the école or ever academicians, they were showing in the salon if they were good enough. Yeah.
Is that actually to scale? Are those people to scale? Are they having to look?
Yes,
up
that is to
clear
scale.
To the top
Yep.
row of pictures?
Yes, it is to scale.
Wow.
They're over life size. Most of these paintings are huge. I mean, the ones that are in color have been enlarged a bit because they popped them out.
Mhm.
But the others are to scale. And it's such a bizarre way to look at art.
I don't know how they can see it.
You
It's
can't.
flat against the wall, it has to kind of pull out.
Yeah, some of them you can see appear to be leaning out. These look like they're leaning out, but still edge to edge, it's like pattern on pattern on pattern.
Well, the way they're hung is from that, that.
There's a railing up there.
Yeah,
Yeah, they
yeah.
seem to be.
And so if you hang things like that, it's gotta lean.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but you can see most of the people aren't looking at the art anyway. I mean, this was a big social event. I mean, okay, let's move on. Oh, I did put those in. Okay, never mind. We're moving on. Because I want to get to some other things. Well, here's what I had. I brought back those lines that we looked at last time, the triangle, and then we have the stabilizing. It's interesting, these are triangles, but this is a more upright equilateral, where this one is emphasizes the horizontal more. So it's more of a sort of passive sort of a scene. So this is a young David. I say young, 33. But that's still young as a professional artist at this point in time. And it's also a David who has not experienced actual revolution yet, because when he does, things are going to change. This is a painting he does in 1789, the year violence is happening throughout this year. There are minor uprisings in July. The Bastille is finally stormed. So this is a real year of chaos. And he's looking at things a little bit different. It is also a royal commission. And in this case, it's also seen from ancient Rome. This is the same size exactly as the Oath of the Horatii. So did he mean these to sort of be related in our minds? They're not pendant pieces. What I mean by that is they aren't meant to hang together. They weren't created to be like a pair, but nonetheless, they are the same size, 11 by 14. Okay, now, I'm not sure, I tried to find out, but I couldn't find out what he was actually originally commissioned to do, but he changed the subject in the commission and changed it to this: the lictors returning to Brutus the bodies of his sons for burial. This also comes from this same period as the Horatii, when there is this conflict between the royalists and the Republicans. And I'm using that word in the correct way, meaning those who support a republic, not what we call Republicans. And in the story, Brutus, and this is clearly not the Brutus of Julius Caesar, this is 800 something BCE. He was a supporter of the Republic, and his two sons were royalists, and there was a decree that he had even established that it was death to anyone supporting royalists, and he had to order his own two sons executed. And this is the officials, lictors, or just, officials, bringing home the bodies of his two sons. And while the subject itself reminds us of Horatio, it's some horrible choices being made. In this painting, Brutus is aware of that. He knows what he's had to do. This isn't someone who's saying, the hell with it, we'll do what we want. This Brutus is over here in the dark. He's suffering. He's feeling the results of his choices, where the Horatii were not. They didn't question for a second, nor did they feel anything about what they did. Brutus does feel that, and we know that because, first of all, very unusual composition. This is not a classical composition. This isn't symmetrical. It's not a beautiful balance on either side. It's skewed. It's a somewhat disturbing space where we get, this little section over here, all in the dark, this sort of piece, again, that divides it kind of into thirds in a way. We have lit area here, this very shadowed area. The use of shade like that, or putting someone in shadow, really creates certain feelings about that person. They're kind of an outsider. He's being presented as an outsider here, and he knows that. The way his hand is, he's thinking about what he's done. This silhouette over here on the left, if I can find my cursor, this is a silhouette of a sculpture that is a personification of the city of Rome. So Rome itself is overlooking all of this, and is clearly what this is all about. Interestingly, in a lot of religious paintings of the Holy Family, Joseph will often be off to the side and in shadow. It's a typical way of showing Joseph, identifying him as an outsider, someone who sort of is in the Holy Family, but sort of isn't in the Holy Family. So he's being shown in the same way. And then we get his wife and daughters. Again, the women are feeling the emotion here as they were before, but they're the upright ones. They're the ones in the center now. So sentiment is being given a different standing for what's happening here. This woman over here on the right is the nurse. Again, we might recognize her from the woman in the blue robe in Horatii was the nurse. And so more like, when I say nurse, that's the term, she was more like a nanny. So she raised these two boys. She's connected to these two young men that have died. Now, this giving primacy to the real sentiment and feeling just a few years later is a real turnaround for David. And I think it has everything to do with the fact that he's begun to experience now real revolution. And it's not just this abstract ideal that it was just a few years earlier.
Now, there's no symmetry here.
It's completely asymmetrical.
Does that mean it's not classic?
I would argue that it's not. It's not classic. Classical. Classic means something else. It's not. I would say it's not a classical composition. It's a classical subject. The forms are classical in the way they're painted, but it's not a classical composition.
Because he was a high Maki, he probably didn't get any official criticism, but did they critique his painting?
He gets rave reviews. He makes these paintings that seem, on one hand, to challenge the monarchy, but the monarchy never seems to see it. It's sometimes it's shocking. Like, can't you see this is about a republic? That these are people who want to overthrow a monarchy, and it's like, don't you get it? And it's like, apparently not. Because they commissioned, this is a royal commission. He did change the subject a bit, but he didn't get any trouble for it. They're too busy in 89. They're either about to be or have just been overthrown. They're not in a position to give him any trouble in 89. But in 85, he was making a painting about founding a republic, but all they saw in it was the idea of heroism and duty and loyalty. And they just dropped it there. They didn't go on and look at it in real depth. At this point, it's a little too late for them to say much about it. When Plutarch, ancient Roman writer, talked about this story, clearly he's from ancient Rome. He's not talking about the painting, but they knew this story in ancient Rome as well. They wrote about it. He said that this act cannot be sufficiently condemned or sufficiently praised, which is an interesting way to think about, he's still making the same judgment, but it's harder for him. He's understanding what he did. He's suffering for his choice. So it's more complicated in terms of what is actually happening.
I think there's really nice movement in it.
It's
Because
beautiful.
You could, if he didn't have her arm pointing, you wouldn't kind of connect all three of them together.
Right, that arm is really important. Your eye enters and moves. And it is much more dynamic than most of what David painted. Certainly more so than the Horatii. Yeah.
When these people were commissioned
Uh-huh.
to do something, were they given the subject?
Well, usually they're told it varies, but they're always typically, yeah, it's not just paint me something. It's I want a scene of this.
Paint my dog, paint a picture of this story. I guess.
Right. And he changed the subject.
Yeah.
You don't do that. But I think it was 89 and he felt like he could do that. I think they were so out of power that he could just say, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. Here, look what's happened. You're out of power. We're going to do a republic, which, by the way, they didn't, but that's what they wanted to do. But yeah, it's far more dynamic than anything he's done before. Yeah, they're going to be most commissions were really, really specific to the point of identifying the size, identifying what colors were going to be used. They could be really, really specific. They vary, some are more vague than others, but there would have been a contract. I mean, a legal contract would be drawn. Yeah.
So you said the royalty didn't see what we see now. Over time, has these pictures from this period had different interpretations?
Yes.
In other words, what your background is, what I see in that picture is going to be different than
Yes.
somebody else. with a
Totally.
different background.
Every work of art is understood differently by everyone who's ever been born since then.
When I had an art class and we all were painting the model in the middle, the drawing. And I had a friend that I was down in Springfield for that, came for a visit, and she said, how does the teacher grade you? And I think the thing for me that came out of that was, because we're all in a circle around the same model, but it's the model, but we're all seeing it differently. And it's kind of like life, we see the same thing, but we have a different perspective of it, and it's just
every age. I mean, we have hindsight they didn't have, but even at that time, people read them differently. People who were involved in the revolution understood what David was saying. They knew perfectly well what he meant. They knew him, where the royalty didn't. So even at the time, there were different, it was interpreted politically differently. But certainly now with hindsight, we can see differently. There are different ways of looking at art. Some people will look at art and interpret it as being about us now, and how can I understand this in the context of what is happening in my world? I don't do that because I'm a historian. My interest in art is what it meant then. Yes, the meaning changes, but I'm not going to take it out of that context because that's not what I'm personally interested in. But particularly you see this with a lot of feminist criticism. In the beginning in the 70s, it became really kind of open to interpret things however you wanted to interpret them, particularly in terms of how they relate to you now, which is perfectly fine. That's one kind of critical thinking. It's one kind of critical writing, but I don't come from that vein. I come from the historian vein. So I don't personally do that. I think we have a right to do that for art of our era, our age, but not historical art. Yeah.
So we're drawn to the red tablecloth, but I can't discern what is on the table, which is in actuality the centerpiece of the painting.
It's in the center. It's a pretty little still life put in there for you to look at if you want to, but it's not what the painting is about. It appears to be a little basket with some sewing in it. Looks like there's maybe a ball of yarn or thread over there on the side. It's in the center, but that's the interesting part of asymmetry. Asymmetry doesn't draw your eye to the center. It draws you and balances visually differently. It's weighted differently. It's a very eccentric composition, but it works and it moves your eye through and around so that you get the story as you're supposed to read it, and very, very different from what we saw before. This is actually, he did this in 91, as a member of the Jacobin, he's a member of important party. And this is small, 26 inches by 41 inches. You can see it's just painted in like a grayscale monochrome, because this is meant to be a study for a much larger painting. The final painting was supposed to be 20 foot by 30 foot. It was never made. This is just the preliminary. It depicts a very important moment in the revolution, the so-called oath of the tennis court, when commoners, known as the Third Estate is another name for commoners in France, when they met at Versailles in 1791 and came together in this tennis court, and they were supposed to, the whole idea was they were going to write a constitution, and then this was going to lead to the republic. And he did dozens and dozens of portraits, individual portraits of people. It was going to take 2 or 3 years to paint the big painting. The problem was the politics were changing so fast in France that he could never get it done, because, you know, one person you put over here, suddenly he's out of power. So now I can't put him there. So let's paint him out. The politics never stayed stable long enough to decide who should or shouldn't be in this painting. Yeah.
So those were real people.
Oh,
that
yeah.
he had in mind
Yeah,
that
these-
actually existed
these
at
are
that point in time,
Very
and
specific.
they
These are the leaders of the revolution. These are those people. The only thing fictional in here, he put in 3 religious leaders from 3 different religions who were supposedly coming together, you know, to support the revolution, and that never happened, I guarantee you. Nor would that ever happen. The clergy were huge supporters of the monarchy, would never support the revolution. This is sort of ideal. He's painting something at one moment in time that he believes at that moment is going to be what the future is in about 5 years. But it was way too unstable for that to ever happen. What the plans were, when you have a painting like this, that's going to take you like 2 years, vast amounts of resources and money, and you don't have a specific person commissioning it and paying you to do that, what you do is you make something like this, and then they make a print of it, like an engraving, and then sell copies of that engraving. And that's how you make the money to paint the painting. This was a common process for artists. If you need to raise the money before you can do the painting, you can do a small version of it, turn it into a print, and then make, you know, many, many copies of that print, and then sell those as a fundraiser.
So the royalty doesn't exist at this time to give him the money to paint.
Correct.
commission, so he has to raise the money.
Right. At this point, yeah, there's nobody out there. The aristocrats are out of power. It's not only the monarchy, but all nobody with money is safe in France. So nobody with money is going to come out and pay him to paint this, because that would identify yourself as someone rich, which puts you in line for the guillotine. So this is how he raises funds. And it's not just at this moment. It was a common practice for artists to do that, to raise money in that way, but it never happened. You know, I did give you this handout that had information, you know, this address that David made. David was a major political leader of the Jacobin Party. When they imprisoned, okay, in 1789, the king and queen were put under house arrest at Versailles. They were later brought to Paris under arrest. So they were out of power in 89. Nobody really knew who was in power. The Jacobin Party was sort of in power. David had some, as the foremost artist in Paris at the time, he became a sort of de facto leader of the art institutions, which was the Academy. But he didn't like the Academy. It favored aristocrats. So they closed the Academy in 1791. And it was completely closed for 2 years, but they were planning on reopening it under another name. And David was part of sort of restructuring it. There were no academicians per se. And so they were debating, how should this place be structured? Who should make decisions about what art should be? And that's what this address is about. David was a member of the National Convention, which was an organization that had been given the power to decide like who should make judgments about art. And he gives this address attacking the ancient regime, or in other words, the monarchy. He calls them tyrants who encourage licentious mores. And I brought this painting in to show you, this is the kind of painting that was popular with the monarchy. It's a style called Rococo, and it tended to be subjects that were somewhat licentious, frivolous, unimportant. It often showed aristocrats out in their garden, having affairs and flirting, really not serious stuff. And you've got these neoclassicists coming along, doing all this serious art, speaking about high moral values. And so this art was just ripe to be attacked. And that's what he's talking about here when he talks about encouraging licentious mores, caprice of a few sybarites, meaning people who enjoy their pleasures, despotic corporations circumscribed genius in the narrow circle of their thoughts, which is interesting because that's exactly what he's doing, as we'll see in a minute. He says, they reject those of us with pure ideas of morality. When people give speeches, it doesn't necessarily mean they're right in what they're saying. He's saying a lot of things that aren't actually true here. But one of the things he is doing is attacking caprice and fashion. He believes art should be timeless and unchanging, not something that should change from moment to moment as your fashion comes and goes. And that's sort of the essence of classical art. It's meant to be timeless and unchanging. And this is what he has in mind when he's thinking about that. That middle paragraph is the most important one. The arts are the imitation of nature in those aspects that are most beautiful and most perfect. A natural sentiment in man attracts him toward the same objective. Number one, it's expressing the Enlightenment ideal that we should always search for perfection and display perfection, the idealized. We don't want, imitate nature, but perfect it. We don't want to see the flaws of the natural world. We want to see the perfected world, perfected nature. And he also suggests that is our natural bent. That's also out of the Enlightenment. The assumption that man is basically rational, that is our nature. If by nature we will be drawn to rational things, we are drawn to the ideal. It is not only in charming the eye that works of art have achieved their end, it is in penetrating the soul, in making a profound impression like that of reality on the spirit. The traits of heroism and civic virtues offer to the eyes of the people.
What you gonna do outside?
So what he's
There's yogurt if you want it.
Hold on.
It's curious with this.
Can I ask everybody to on Zoom to mute your microphone, because we can hear everything that's happening. Okay.
I'm used to it always being muted. I didn't touch it.
So this is about the corruption of the previous regime. It's about art should be timeless, it should be idealized, and it should have a purpose. It should be important, it should be heroic. And these paintings are none of those. It seems to reflect a corrupt society, immoral society that's centered on sensual pleasure. It's certainly a fleeting style. It just developed as a style. I would say it is idealized. It doesn't look very real to me, but it certainly isn't elevated. There's nothing, there's no heroic virtue there, quite the opposite of heroism in this little flirtatious scene. And that's what matters to him more than anything. So he's arguing anyone who believes this, that's who should be in charge of the arts and have a social purpose. David's role, his political role, becomes very important by 93. That's when the Reign of Terror begins. This is when the Jacobins hold all power, and under their leader, Robespierre, the executions began. And it's one of his most famous paintings, The Death of Marat. Marat was a very important member of the Jacobin Party and a friend of David's. He was a writer. He had some kind of skin condition. I don't remember what it was, but he would have to soak in a tub for hours every day. And he developed this habit where he would, sit in his bathtub and do work, write letters. And the letter there that you see, it's tilted so that it's readable. And it's actually a letter that he's writing to the widow of a fallen revolutionary, and he's going to send her money. It's designed to make him look compassionate and like a good guy. And he was assassinated by this woman named Charlotte Corday, who broke into his home and stabbed him when he was in his bath. So this is a true story. And it was either a good thing she did this, or the most horrible thing in the world that she did this, depending on your political point of view. Obviously, if you're a Jacobin, this was horrible. If you're a little bit more moderate than the Jacobins were, or a royalist, then this would have not been. This would have been a good thing to do. It is what we call reportage. Reportage, David begins to do some reportage. It's a new thing in art. Reportage, you can see the word report in there, reportage. It's an image of a current event, which we haven't seen in art, hasn't existed in Western art, but a current event at the time, but it's historicized or historiated. It's a story's written around it. It's given a moral point of view. It's not just a simple statement of fact, it's a glorified interpretation of the story. It's something we're going to see them doing in landscape. It's a way of sort of elevating it. So it isn't realism. When we come to realism, they're going to be depicting, real things that are happening around them. This is a more, I'm going to call it more romanticized, because it is presented clearly in his point of view. On this wooden box, it says for Marat, and then signed David. So it's like a memorial. David has painted this picture, and he's presenting Marat in a very important way. Let me say, Marat is not a figure that I would ever hold up as someone who should be memorialized. Actually, nobody in the Jacobin Party should be memorialized. They made France or Paris so much worse than the monarchy had been before them. This is when the Reign of Terror begins. And really the whole program of the Reign of Terror is Marat's idea. Marat's idea was to put guillotines on wagons and drive them all over Paris, and anyone you saw that had any money at all, kill them instantly. That's the Reign of Terror. It's to purge not only aristocrats, they're way beyond purging the monarchy at this point. 93 is the year that the king and queen are finally executed as well. David actually signed the death warrant of the king and queen. He's the only person who did so to survive that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so Marat is not, to my mind, a great hero. He wanted to slaughter everybody. And David is presenting him here in a very heroic way. In fact, he's really basing this design on a very recognizable trope in art, and that is like the entombment of Christ, for example. That arm, the way he's falling in that arm, he knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was referencing. He's turning Marat into a martyr. This is clearly him interpreting this scene and putting him in the position of a martyr. And we see it even in something that's not the entombment, and like Michelangelo's famous Pietà. It's the same thing. That's the position he's being placed in. This wonderful background, I love this big sort of empty, powerful space. This is a really good example of negative space being quite powerful in what it says. It's a very poignant moment. It's sort of very quiet. There's something very quiet about this scene, as if time has stopped. The dramatic lighting, the pause, very calculated. He knew just what he was doing. So this is in 93, and all hell breaks loose for the next 3 years, but that will end in 99. Because, okay, first of all, when Robespierre, what happened is the Jacobins killed everybody else, then they started turning on each other. And the Jacobins started dying. He's lucky, number one, he's lucky to have survived this. When Robespierre is executed, that ends the reign of terror. And it was like instantaneous. It was like 1 minute, he's gone. And everybody just like takes a deep breath. It's like just heaves a sigh of relief. And they set up a temporary government called the Directory. They just sort of invented this. It held order, it kept the country running, but it wasn't good. It was very corrupt, and it went on for a little while, but it will go on until 1799. When Napoleon comes in and takes power. But during this period, it is a period of sort of calm, finally, after the chaos and quiet. And David paints what is really, I think, one of his greatest works, the Sabine women. It was not commissioned, and again, he does this on his own, and ends up making some good money on this piece. He's doing this scene for a number of reasons. The subject matter, ancient Rome, early period, founding of the Roman Republic time frame. And he's doing it as a direct reference to another very well-known painting. One of the most famous paintings in France at this time was a painting by Nicolas Poussin, who was a god in France. Usually in French writing, you don't see a reference to Nicolas Poussin, you see a reference to the great Nicolas Poussin. It always says the great, that leads to his name. He was the foremost French painter of the 17th century, and it was on his style that the Academy was founded in 1648. When they founded the Academy in 1648, it was to teach the style of the great Nicolas Poussin. And Poussin painted this painting called The Abduction of the Sabine Women. The story is from ancient Rome, and the Romans, who were one of the Latin tribes, who was led by Romulus. They invited their neighboring tribe, the Sabines, who were another Latin tribe, to their village, and then they stole all the Sabines' women and drove the men off. And that's the story that Poussin depicts. It's when the women are being abducted and the men will be driven off. Not a very heroic subject, but nonetheless, one that was dramatic, and the founding of Rome, etc. What David gives us is the scene 3 years later when the Sabine men come back and invade the city to get their women back. And what happens is, this is Romulus, this is his wife Hercilia, and this is her father, the Sabine. And what happens in the story is all the women throw themselves between the men with now all these little 3-year-old babies. Right? They've been there 3 years. They now all have babies with the Romans. And it's another situation where the women know, if this goes on, if this happens, nobody wins. They lose again. You lose because they're now attached to these new families and their old families. So what you have is now women throwing themselves in the middle. It's one more step in that path from the Horatii through the lictors, now up to the Sabine. Not only are the women's view spoken, this is about the women. They are creating reconciliation. This is about reconciliation, which is not something you would have seen earlier. Every one of these paintings is related to what's going on at that moment in Paris. This is a call for reconciliation as the women throw themselves in the middle of the fighting. So it's in the style of, well, what happens is David actually out classicals the great Poussin, and nobody thought that was possible, but David is actually more classical than the man who founded classicism in France. Yes, that's much more classical. It's more frozen and statuesque. The figures are more linear in their painting style. It's really, I like it better. I think it's better than the Busan. But then, that's the difference between 17th century and almost 19th century as a style. It's spectacular. He ignored the salon. He didn't want to show this in the salon that year. Salons have started back up again since 93. He showed this in his private rooms. He had private studio rooms in the Louvre, which is still a palace. The Louvre is not a museum as yet, but it will be within the next few years. He set it up in his private rooms, and on the wall opposite it, he had it lined with a massive mirror. And he charged admission for people to come in and see this. The mirror is there because you were supposed to not face the painting, but face the mirror. And when you did, you saw yourself in the middle of this scene. That's how you're supposed to see it. You were the one, stopping the fighting. And he made enough money from just charging a little bit to buy himself a rather large country home from doing this privately. This is an important moment, actually, an important thing, because throughout this century, we're going to see artists finding various ways to have outlets to show their art, so they're less and less dependent on the academy or the salon. And this is one early, and there are just these little one at a time, somebody tries something, and it's going to get more pronounced as the century goes along. It actually stayed on view for 5 years. So 5 years of people coming through paying to see this. That's how he got his country home.
Is this all they'd see? I mean, they came to see
This painting, that's it. This painting in the mirror. I mean, it was such a novel idea. Nobody ever done that before. Well, we got to go see this. I would love to see it that way. It sounds, interesting, really spectacular. Must have been powerful to see yourself within that painting. Here you can see them, Hercilia throwing herself in the middle, and his shield. It is such a wonderful foil to the, we've come a long way from the Horatia, haven't we? The sense of in each one of these, David uses gender to make a statement. In the one, it's all masculine, weak women, and then we go through an intermediary step, and now we end up with this, where the women, it's that white garment of hers that your eye goes to. She is the scene. So yeah, this is someone who's grown a lot in a few years.
Was David ever a Jacobite?
Yes, he was a member of the Jacobin Party. They were called that. They were called Jacobins because they used to meet. They were just a political party. They were called Jacobins because they met at the old Jacobin monastery. There was a monastery in Paris that went back very long time. And people just called it the old Jacobin monastery. It was a deserted, ruined structure. And that's where they had their meetings. So they became known as the Jacobins. That's where the name comes from. It was just a political party. But yeah, dramatic change and growth in someone as they experience the world. He turns to portraiture. Napoleon comes in 1799. Napoleon has been out fighting a foreign war for France for quite a long time. David actually already knew him long before he comes back to Paris, knew him when he was just a general. Napoleon's had enough. Basically, he just, Paris, get it together. You've been screwing things up for so long. The directory was so corrupt. He just walks in 79 and says, screw this, I'm taking power. And he sets up something called the consulate, which is based on a Roman form of government in which you have 3 leaders, 3 consuls that were supposedly equal. He was one of those 3, but he was really in charge, and restores order and gets it less corrupt. It was a big period of portraiture was popular, and David made a real career of it. This is a beautiful portrait from this period. He painted the whole Recamier family, but I like this portrait because it shows this influence of antiquity. Women's gowns, this is influenced by old scenes of ancient Greek and Roman women in these flowy gowns. This is not a typical 18th century woman's gown. They were huge and complicated and corsets and I mean, farthingales and these big, ribs. I mean, women's clothes were horrendous in the 18th century. This is a huge change. It's soft, it's flowy, it's casual. That's all because of this classical influence from antiquity. The hairstyle is Roman style of hair. It's loose, curls hanging down. The furniture is neoclassical. These designs are based on furniture in Greek art. Everything in here is classical. It just really shows you that how it affected style at that moment in time. David immediately began painting for Napoleon. Not only did he survive, every other member of the Jacobin Party is dead now, except David. Every other person who signed the death warrant of the king and queen is dead now, except for David. Everybody always wants, how did he do this? He was astute politically. He was really good at shifting his allegiance when he needed to. All of a sudden now he's Napoleon's person. I think it's that and his fame. Famous people get treated differently. They just do. He's a celebrity. And that certainly had something to do with it. While he painted for Napoleon, and Napoleon wanted him as a first painter, they never really got along that well, and Napoleon didn't really like his style that much, as we'll see in a minute. Napoleon is a different person from a monarchy. These are three versions of the same scene. Napoleon crossing the Alps. Napoleon understood politics. Napoleon was a politician. He wasn't someone born to his rule. He wasn't someone who ruled by divine right. He worked his way up through the military. He was in position because people liked him. And he understood that he needed to present himself. No, the kings didn't need to do that. They didn't care whether you liked that they were king or not. They ruled by divine right. Napoleon didn't. So he wants someone who has the ability to present heroism, his own heroic nature. He refused to sit for this, but David didn't really need him to sit for this. Not very believable anyway. He just needed the portrait. The rest of it is sort of made up. What was important, not only showing him heroic as a military victor, but also linking him to three really important people in France's history. And that is, let me move this ahead once more and I can see it. Here's Bonaparte. Right here is chiseled the name Hannibal. And down here, it says Carolus Magnus, who is Charlemagne. These are three heroic figures, Hannibal and Charlemagne, famous for having crossed the Alps. Charlemagne is French, Hannibal wasn't, but nonetheless, he's linking himself to historic military figures who did the same thing he did, made war and crossed the Alps. So those names need to be there for him. I think these are all just really weird paintings. It's David trying to do what Napoleon wants, but it's not natural for David. David is a classicist. He wants something still, something permanent. Napoleon wants a rearing horse with a lot of movement, a lot of energy, and David puts these two things together and you get something just a little odd to my eye.
I was going to say the horse is not exactly docile. I mean, he's kind of challenging.
Yeah, well, see, that's a good point, because Napoleon wanted to show himself in charge of the horse. That, if you were with us last year when we did, or this spring, we did the Asian art, what kept coming up in China was the importance of horses and images of horses. Because if you could breed horses and tame horses and ride horses, that proved you were a good leader of men. And so showing your ability to tame a wild beast like this was sign of your power. And Napoleon is showing that here. He wants to be seen in control of this powerful horse. It just doesn't, to me, stylistically work that well. Yeah. There are three different paintings you did. It's not uncommon, but it's not common either. It sometimes happens. 3 identical like this from the same person, that's a little unusual. But there were different requests. One is at Versailles. One is at a small museum that's just outside Paris, and one is in Vienna at the Belvedere Museum. So I don't know the story exactly as to who got what when they were first made, but there are 3, and clearly they're different. He didn't do them identically. There are not only differences in color, but if you really look at it, there are slight differences here and there. And really one of the last works he did for Napoleon, he got the commission. Okay, in 1804, Napoleon has had enough with this consulate and being one of 3 leaders, and said, screw it, this is an empire, I'm the emperor. He just declares an empire. It's just that easy.
He crowns himself,
Huh?
doesn't he?
He crowns himself. In fact, David got the commission for 4 paintings by Napoleon. He was supposed to do the coronation, the enthronement, the presentation of the eagle standards, and the arrival at the town hall. 4 massive paintings. He only completed 2, and on the coronation, he didn't do what Napoleon asked. He didn't show the Napoleon crowning himself, which he did. He shows instead Napoleon crowning Josephine. So it is a coronation technically. It's not exactly what Napoleon wanted. Here is the painting we just looked at. I wanted you to see the scale of it. Yes, the Pope is there, but traditionally the Pope crowns the emperor, like Charlemagne, etc. But Napoleon took the crown from the Pope and put it on his own head, because if the Pope crowned him, that would suggest the Pope was more powerful than him. So by crowning himself, he suggests I'm the only one powerful enough to declare myself an emperor. So yeah, it's a very famous moment. Now, this was a huge job he had to do. And these are all, specific people that were there. Yeah.
Did he paint all these himself, or did he have his apprentice?
There's no way he painted all of these. He had a studio full of people. There's no way he painted all of any of his paintings. He had studios of people who would do it, but still, he probably did the portraits, but then he had some students who were really great portraitists too. So it's often difficult to know exactly what he did, but I guarantee he did not paint all of this. So it would have been impossible.
The urn, I see it.
Not necessarily, not the ones, not the,
The ones who
I know he didn't paint the lictors, the one where they're bringing the bodies of Brutus's sons. I know at least 2 of his students who painted parts of that.
But to get into the
Horatii, he
to get
did.
into the academy,
Pardon?
to get into the academy.
No, they were in his studio. He just assigned them to paint this. I think the Oath of the Horatii, I think he painted that himself. But most of those other large ones, other artists in his studio would have helped him. And that was just normal. Yeah.
Do you have any idea, like that says 21 by 32 feet, how long it would take to produce a painting?
Well,
that size?
It depends how many people are working on it, I mean, as much as I do, I'm thinking one person couldn't have done this. It would have taken years. I mean, it just would have. So, and as it was, it took him a year or 2, and Napoleon wasn't happy that it was taking time, and he wasn't happy that Napoleon wouldn't pay him.
Wow.
Napoleon kept refusing to pay him, and he was getting really pissed at that, which I can understand, because this takes a lot of money and time and effort, and he wasn't really happy about it at all. So they weren't getting along. Napoleon was actually commissioning a number of his students, which I'll show you some work by them in a minute. So he wasn't that thrilled with David, and David wasn't that thrilled with him. They never really got along well. But it is a gorgeous, I mean, he had to do individual portraits first, separately, just of all the people, and then those portraits had to be put into a painting like this. So a grand painting that many people would have worked on. Just composing it is a huge job. Here's a detail. You can see the sort of opulence of the forms, the colors, the richness, the textures. It really is a beautiful scene.
It would be analogous to a picture, I mean, a snapshot of
Right. It's again reportage. It's sort of the contemporary moment of the thing that's happening right now, but it's grandiose. It's elevated and made more. You don't really have to elevate the coronation of Napoleon. I mean, that's pretty elevated as a subject anyway. But he takes it as far as he can. Napoleon is finally defeated first in 1814 and then again in 1815 because he's kicked out and he comes back and then he's kicked out again. When he comes back the second time, he forces everybody to sign a kind of loyalty oath. And David signs that loyalty oath. And then 100 days later, Napoleon's kicked out again. So here's David one more time, picking the wrong side, and he's politically in jeopardy, and he does just fine. He actually did go to jail for that for like 6 months, and then he was out for a while and then served another 6 months. So he did serve some prison time for that one. But you know, he's kind of pretty much out of favor. And in fact, he is sent into exile. I think after he gets out of jail second time, he's forced out of France. And I think he's just changed sides one too many times. And his art is rapidly out of style. You know, by 1816, there are younger artists who are working in a different way. And classicism is starting to look old, a little old-fashioned. It wasn't like he was destitute. He was invited to every court in Europe, wanted David to come and paint for him. Paint for them. He went to Brussels, probably because they were French speakers and he was French. And he was later actually invited back to France, but he didn't go. He stayed in Brussels. He had a huge studio. He admiring, don't feel sorry for him. He was surrounded by admiring students. He continued to be extremely successful until he died in 1825. By then, the world had changed. It had moved on, and it had moved on particularly through some of his students, and one in particular, Jean-Antoine Gros. Gros was a good friend of David's. He had been a student of his in the 90s. Gros, their relationship was an interesting one. When David left, he actually left his studio to Gros. He turned it over to him. So the most important studio or atelier in Paris was David's. So Gros took that over. So that was a big honor to sort of step into David's shoes. But Gros, while he embraced the classical doctrine, it was against his nature. As a person, he was much more emotional and romantic. And so his character was fighting against classical art. So he began with paintings like this. Now, this is something he painted before, of Napoleon before. When the Reign of Terror started in 1793, it was dangerous for aristocrats. Gros was from a very wealthy family, and his life, while he was a student of David's, his life was still in jeopardy during the Reign of Terror. Well, David, who was a member of the Jacobin Party, nonetheless helped Gros escape from Paris and helped him get to Italy. So yes, he believed in all this purging of aristocrats, but he still helped his friend, you know, I got to give him some due, helped his friend get out. And that probably saved his life. And while he was in Italy, he actually met Napoleon and Josephine when Napoleon was still a general in the French army. So this is painted before Napoleon was who he later became. This is before he went back to Paris at all. It's just a young man. And Napoleon liked Gros' style from the beginning. he always preferred it. It's much more romantic. I mean, Gros is really opening the door for romantic art, even though he's never, no one at the time acknowledged him for that. And later, the young romantics never acknowledged him. Gros had a really bad, I really feel sorry for him because he was a man out of his own time. He was a little early. He was stuck in a classical world, but he was really a romantic sensibility. And the younger romantics come along, just sort of mocked him. David kept from Brussels, David kept telling him, stop doing this romantic stuff and get back to your good classical roots. And Gros tried. He really did force himself to make more classical art. And in doing so, the young romantic artist mocked him and made fun of him. He had a really rough time. He's not the only artist that did, but had a rough time. This is my favorite portrait of Napoleon, and there are many, many of them, but it is romantic. There's a lot of emotion there, a lot of energy there. It's beautiful painting of him. But the one he's most famous for is the depiction he did in 1804. Now, this is the year Napoleon declared the empire. Napoleon visiting the plague house in Jaffa. And this is pure Gros. And if the young romantics didn't see how romantic this was, that's their mistake, because this is pure romantic art. It takes place in the Middle East, in Jaffa. Napoleon's troops were there. And while they were in Jaffa, a plague broke out, and they're using a mosque. You can see they're inside of a mosque, and this is looking out at the courtyard. They're using it as a hospital, what they call a plague house, or sometimes they call it a pest house. They would isolate the people with the plague there. And Napoleon has come to visit those soldiers of his with the plague, and he's reaching out and touching the sores of one of the people. You can see here's a detail as he's reaching out. Now, a lot of interesting things happening here. First of all, we have a new use of the nude. I mean, traditionally in art, if you remember, nudity symbolizes heroism. This goes back to ancient Greece. Nude figures were used because they were seen as heroic. Clearly, that is not how they're being used here. The nudity suggests vulnerability. It's a very different, it's really a very modern way. The heroic nude disappears in the modern world. And it becomes, nudity begins to suggest more fragility. You're exposed, you're fragile, you're vulnerable. That's a different way of thinking about nudity. And of course, by reaching out and touching the sores under his arms, he's obviously a heroic gesture, or he's attempting to suggest heroism. Now,
Is he trying to parallel himself with God?
yeah, laying on of hands,
Yes.
right? That's there. That's right there under the surface. I think he absolutely was thinking that way. There is something godlike about it. It's not overt, it's just heroic, but absolutely, I think he is making that association.
Because we got vaccine for smallpox.
Probably. Now, the truth of it is, he did not go to this hospital to visit the troops. In fact, he abandoned a lot of his troops who were ill. So this never happened. In fact, he did just the opposite. This is propaganda. This is pure political propaganda, as were a lot of his scenes of him, leading battles and the like. I mean, he's a politician. They lie, believe it or not. Who knew? But nonetheless, that's what it's meant to be. Now, some people have suggested that he was in some way referencing David's early work. And when you look at it, it's interesting how they're constructed. You've got like the arches in the back that divide the space. I think that, heroic figure in the center, I don't know if he's doing that. If he did, I don't think he was like mocking David or trying to make a statement about David. He may have been influenced by that idea of the framing arch, which wouldn't surprise me, that's his teacher. But his work is not, directly referencing. It's asymmetrical, it's colorful in a way that David's never were. David was not a colorist. Gros is, these are rich colors, there's subtle variations in color. When David used color, it was your primaries, blue, red, yellow, that's it, solid colors, no subtle variations of colors. Classicists don't do that. Classicists draw. They're not interested in color. Remember, they spend their lives studying drawing. Line is what a classicist focuses on, not color. It's the romantics who bring in rich colors, subtle colors, and build scenes with color. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I just wanted to make the point that Napoleon favors this. Napoleon was a man of the people. He worked his way up. He appealed directly to the masses, and that's what his art does. He's not painting for an academy. He's painting for the patron who wants to be understood in a certain way. So it's paralleling, in a sense, Napoleon's taste. I think Napoleon is directly responsible for the rise of Romanticism. Sometimes one person's taste can change art if that person is like the emperor. And I think his preference for this more passionate, more emotional, more personal art does open the door. And classicism was just too stale. Classicism never lasted very long. It always went in and out of favor. The problem with classicism is it's formulaic. It's too much of a formula, and people get tired of that too fast. And somebody comes along and we don't want to do this anymore. And then it'll come back again because someone wants to reinstate the good old style. And then it'll get stale again in another 20 years and go out of fashion again. So classicism never lasts very long for that because it is formulaic. And then one last artist I want to talk about who really is ushering in the romantic. And I want to talk about Géricault, and the second reading I had on your handout is Géricault's. Géricault's the first person to begin to express what many people were thinking about the negative impact of the academy. And that's why I chose this excerpt from this unpublished manuscript. Unpublished at the time is what that means. It means he never published it. Obviously, it's published now because we're looking at it. It was discovered at some point and later published. But he goes right to it. He attacks the competitions. These schools keep their students in a state of constant emulation by means of frequent competitions. And it would seem at first sight as if they were extremely useful. Doesn't work that way, though. He says, I observe with regret that from the time of their establishment, these schools have had quite unforeseen effect. Instead of giving service, they have done real harm. He's the first person to really point out the negatives of the academy. For while they have produced 1,000 mediocre talents, they cannot claim to have formed the best of our painters. That's pushing it a little bit, because David's a product of the academy, but he's not wrong about the 1,000 mediocre talents. That's what happens when you turn art into a formula that anybody can follow. That's what happens. He says, is it not dangerous for them to study together for years, subjected to the same influences, copying the same models, following the same route? How can we expect them to retain any kind of originality? Will they not unconsciously submerge whatever individual qualities they may possess, adapting their own ways of conceiving nature's beauty to one uniformity of sentiment? I shall even go further and assert that this is really the important part, that obstacles and difficulties which repel mediocre men are a necessity and nourishment to genius. They mature and elevate it when an easier road would have remained cold. Now, that is actually a stunningly modern statement, because it's the first reference in the art world by anyone to a way of looking at change that is completely embraced in the modern era. And I'm talking about Hegel's dialectic. In the 18th century, philosopher Hegel, German philosopher Hegel, was writing about a theory. He created a model that describes change, or how things change. And his model, which is known as a dialectic, was based on what he called the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. He said that first an idea is formed, that's the thesis. And that immediately gives rise to its opposite, its antithesis or its antithesis. He says those two then coalesce, and out of that is born something new, a synthesis. And that synthesis is neither the thesis or the antithesis, something new that comes from them. That becomes the new thesis. Then that gives rise to its opposite, its antithesis. It's a continuing, ongoing way of looking at change as coming from conflict. Think about that. And that's what he's saying. He's saying that these obstacles and difficulties which repel mediocre men are a necessity to genius. You can't reach your full potential unless you face obstacles, unless somebody criticizes you for this or that. What he's describing, this idea of opposition and conflict leading to growth, is the model of the avant-garde. That is the essence of an avant-garde, where you face opposition. It's something that is taken for granted by the 20th century, that a new style comes along. Okay, thesis, I work in this style. Antithesis, I don't like that style at all. I hate that style. I work in the opposite way. What comes out of that? Something that's neither of them. There's a synthesis. A new style comes from that, which somebody else doesn't like and says the opposite. It's a model of change. Every age builds models. If you study history, every age that's ever existed has constructed models to understand the world, some sort of model for seeing, for expressing how they believe the world works. No model is necessarily right or wrong. A model either works or doesn't work, and many different models might be constructed. So a model isn't like some great truth. It's just a model. It's just something that is constructed, and it actually works to explain the world. But he's previewing what we're going to see building in the 19th century. This sort of idea that art, that there's nothing wrong with art being oppositional, and there's nothing wrong with someone not liking your style. That's a positive thing, because that's going to lead to this growth. And we'll talk more about the avant-garde, because this is the model of the avant-garde, and this is what Jericho's presenting. I want to look quickly at one work by him. Why does he feel this way? Why does he oppose the Academy? Everybody else just wants to be in. Why is he saying this is bad? Well, his background, for one thing, he actually came from a fairly well-to-do family. And because of that, it affected his whole path of his life. He never needed money. He's self-trained. He couldn't get into the academy because he didn't go through the schools to get him in. He was rejected, particularly because of his figure. You needed to go through that school to get the figure down. They knew the figure, they knew how to do the figure the way they wanted the figure done. And I don't care how good you are, you're self-taught, you're never going to get to the highest levels. And I think to a certain extent, his never being successful with the academy turned him against the academy, but it made him think about that. But he did he did want approval, and he did set out at one point to compete for the Prix de Rome, but he set himself a task to do that, and he studied the figure on his own. He made the first round. He passed the sort of compositional drawing, but he failed the second round, which was the figure. And then he took himself to Rome. He didn't need to win the Rome prize. He had money. Okay, I didn't win the Rome prize, so now he goes to Rome on his own dime, which is fine. So he goes to Rome, and he studies not classical antiquity, but he studies the paintings and sculpture of Michelangelo. This is a different mindset. This is someone who's not interested in classical accuracy. He's interested more in a romantic vein because Michelangelo is the romantic of all the Renaissance artists. He's the most influential on the 19th century, particularly the romantics. So that's what he's studying. And while he's there, well, actually he comes back, but he's on the lookout for a subject. He wants to do some grand statement and he's looking for a subject. And suddenly in 1817, the subject comes along, and it's a book that is published that tells the story of an event that took place the year before that. In 1816, there was this horrible event, this shipwreck that took place. Ship was called the Medusa, and it was sailing from France down the west coast of Africa, and it hit a sandbar, and it started slowly sinking. And the captain of the ship and all of the wealthiest aristocrats on board took the lifeboats, and they left all the other people, who quickly built a makeshift raft. And for a while, the lifeboats towed the raft behind them, but then it was slowing them down, so they just cut them loose and left them. And for like 15 days, there were about, I think, 150 people originally on this raft. And you can see it goes on way back here. Hell broke out over those 15 days. People murdered people. Somebody attempted to commit mass suicide by sinking the raft. They turned to cannibalism. When they were finally found, there were 15 people still alive, and he shows 15 people here. Not accurately, but he does show the people. And he's chosen to show the moment when they spot a ship on the horizon. If you look, there's a tiny little mast of a ship right back there that they've just spotted. Now, none of this was known at the time. The government completely covered this up, but two of the survivors wrote a book the year afterwards, and it was published in 1817. That's the book that all hell broke loose in Paris. And the reason it was scandalous was because the captain of the ship. Now, when Napoleon was thrown out in 1815, the Bourbon dynasty was restored. This is a period called the Restoration. Kings are back in France, and it's the same dynasty of kings that were thrown out in the first place. Big difference, they wrote a constitution. These are not all powerful kings. There is a constitutional monarchy, but they're still kings. And the king, Louis XVIII, was actually really criticized. There was a lot of political opposition to this monarchy. And Jericho was part of that sort of liberal circle that criticized the monarchy, because the king was constantly giving out awards and positions and honors to people who were unqualified and didn't deserve it. And the captain of this ship was a completely unqualified person. He should never have been in that position at all. And that's the scandal, was really the corrupt nature of the whole situation. And it all fell on the king. This all fell on the shoulders of the king. It was just political hot button. And as a liberal, Jericho wants to tell you this story, and he wants to tell you this story in a very specific way so that you will sympathize with these people. What he's giving us here is a very, very modern sense of the victim as hero, which is a modern concept. It didn't exist before. We absolutely have that in our world. We call people heroic all the time, who really were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, traditional heroism is defined in terms of self-sacrifice. We still have that too. You know, you choose to put yourself in a dangerous situation. That's heroic. But we also use it for people who didn't make choice at all, who were just victims and managed to survive. But that's a very modern idea, and you see it here really for the first time, this heroic victim. Now, so that you feel positively, he shows us these people not as they were at all. Man, when these people came in, they were skin and bone. They were burned completely. They're, sunburned everywhere. They were sores. They look awful. But he doesn't want to show you that, because then you won't identify with them. You won't see them as heroic. So he gives us something very different from that, makes it very noble in many ways. So that's part of its politics. You know, stylistically, he's just borrowing on Baroque style, you know, dramatic diagonals, you know, a lot of movement and energy. You know, he gives us the two halves with the wave over here that looks like it's going to crush them. But on this side, we get the light that suggests they're going to be saved. This ship was sailing to the French colony of Senegal on the west coast of Africa, which was a French colony. So that we know that, he puts a couple of different African men in the picture. There were no African men on the raft. If there were any on the ship, you know, they went in the water. Also remember, we know these people were killed each other, they ate each other. I mean, this is anything but necessarily what we would call heroic, but the politics makes it necessary. He did submit this to the Salon of 1819 under the title A Shipwreck, not under the title Raft of the Medusa. You don't put the word Medusa on this, but everybody knew what it was. I mean, this was, you know, absolutely known as to what this was.
Isn't Medusa the lady with the snake hair?
Medusa, yes, that's the ship was named for Medusa. That's definitely who she
That
was.
The name of the ship.
The ship that sank. So the raft of the Medusa means the raft made by the people who were on that sunken ship. Soon after they were found, 5 more people died. So really there were only 10 actual survivors out of the 150 that were on that raft. Yeah, to do this properly, he's in his studio, he would go to hospitals and collect severed limbs, and he would go to collect the heads of beheaded criminals so that he could study what, you know, dead limbs look like and dead heads. One, I can't remember who it was, one artist who visited his studio said that it smelled like a charnel house. So I can imagine it wasn't a pleasant place at all. And definitely, you know, fact is giving way to politics. But we've clearly stepped into a romantic world where this is a very personal interpretation of a scene, and that individuality and the personal nature of art is one of the things that's going to drive romantic art. And you know, Jericho is so important because he was a sort of an outsider in the art world, never really made it through that system. And because of that, was the first to really look at the system and talk about that system very early on. You know, 1822 is very early to be speaking about that. But we'll be encountering and talking more about the Academy as we move through the century. What I want to do next time is I want to look at romantic art, but particularly in the form of landscape. You know, that's one type of romantic art. This is the great age of romance, of landscape painting. And I want to talk about it, you know, why does that happen? When does land become landscape? And what is that process where you take the natural world and you turn it into something else? So there's a lot to talk about there, and we'll look at it as it happens in different places in the West, in different countries. So it's a really interesting art form. So I'm very interested in landscape. So does anybody have any other questions, comments on anything?
In the hierarchy, what comes after landscape?
You mean after Romanticism?
No, there's historical.
Oh, you mean in the
landscape and-
okay. I think I actually told you wrong. It's history painting, and then portraits are second. I think I said landscape was second. Portraits are second, then landscape, and then still life.
Oh, still.
Still life's down at the bottom. There was briefly a 5th category for a few years that covered that kind of Rococo art that the royalty liked, but as soon as they were thrown out, so was that category. So we're back to the 4 main categories. But landscape is embraced by the Romantics.
So all these elements you named are going on side by side, but they're coming in and out of favor, and there's people doing, there's still people painting portraits for.
Absolutely.
There's still landscapers. And there's
It's
still
all happening at the same time.
And they're sort of criticizing each other, but.
Well, they're not criticizing each other.
Sort of like parallel ways of keeping them painted, right?
Well, they're just different people want different subjects.
Right.
I mean, they're not criticizing each other.
Well, did any painters do two things?
Yes, they kind of sometimes had to. As much as everyone wanted to be a history painter, and you may be embraced that way, clearly David also did portraits. Almost everybody did portraits because that's how you paid the rent. There was always commissions for portraits. So portrait was sort of, some people just specialized in it, but kind of everybody did it because that's what everybody wanted. So there's always going to be portraits. You will find, particularly, there's a lot of overlap between landscape and still life. I know a lot of people that did both of those. But history painters are generally not going to do a landscape or a still life. They may do portraits to pay the rent. Portraits of important people are elevated. You know, you do a portrait of Napoleon, you know, you're not down there with the other portrait painters. That's different. So, you know, but portraits are always there. There's just different demands from different quarters. And when the romantics come in, that's gonna, you know, landscapes, what we're going to be seeing happening is, you know, a middle class is being born. What I haven't talked about is, because we've still been mostly in the 18th and early 19th century, but the Industrial Revolution is starting. It's already started in England, and it's going to start in the rest of the Western world by the 19th century. And that's going to make huge changes. One of the things it's going to do is going to give us a middle class and also a slightly educated middle class. That's what we'll talk about next time. That's going to change art because they don't want history paintings.
Peggy, point back to that.
This one?
Yes. Can you pop it up?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. The whole thing is done in deeper tones of browns and.
Yeah.
But this red thing on this guy's head.
Pops. Yeah.
It goes down, it intrigues me.
Well, it's there to pop. There's a little bit on the other side too. There's a little red over there. There's usually 2 or 3 little touches of it
Yeah,
to balance.
yeah.
But yeah, it's just meant to pop.
Everything is so.
Total.
So.
Yeah, he
neutral,
wasn't
and
a
then
great
that little
colorist.
Red thing down his head,
It's to balance the warm
Yeah.
and the cool colors and, you know, to pop them. So, you know, there's a lot of thought given
Uh-huh.
into balancing this shape with that shape, balancing that color with that color, and just a pop. So yeah, all that's very intentional in the design. You're welcome. You're welcome. We'll see you next week, everybody. I'm really looking forward to next week because landscape is something that's very important to me. And
With all this history, I think it's going to be